Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I like to jokingly say all the time when I hear an introduction, I wish my sons were around so they could hear that I actually do some things other than serve as an ATM for them. But I have two really good sons who I'll talk a little bit about in just a few minutes. But it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. After hearing Neely, I guess, speak, I was wondering why I was even invited to come. So I don't, that's a hard act to follow. But congratulations to each of you scholars. And it is my hope that you will be lifelong scholars. That is what I want to kind of talk about a little bit here. I am, as you heard, a proud product of the Buncombe County school system, a graduate of T.C. Roberson High School. Very proud of my home. I lived away from here for a little while, probably about 22 years, and lived in Raleigh. It was my research in graduate school at Chapel Hill that brought me back, and it has been a very rewarding experience to be back here in Asheville, to be here close to my family and friends, and also be a part of Asheville's University at UNC Asheville. I have to say this, I was sitting over there with Dr. Baldwin, and someone said, well, Dr. Baldwin is probably the person responsible for bringing you here tonight. I said, yeah, let's say that, and then he might be the blame for that after I'm done. But about a couple of years ago, what I want to talk to you about, you probably see the title here, curiosity. Curiosity is the fuel for lifelong learning. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this, I gave this kind of talk about a couple of years ago. And I have to tell a funny story. I started it out by saying, confession is good for the soul. So let's have a moment of confession here. When I did this talk, I was asked, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Creative Mornings program, and it's a program that's done here in Asheville. There are about 300 cities across the globe that do the Creative Mornings program. So on a certain day of the month, you will have all of these cities around the globe getting together to have a conversation about a particular topic. I was asked by the Creative Mornings program here to consider coming and being one of the speakers for one of those events. So if this was a year out when we started planning this, so they give you this list of topics that will be the focus of each month's conversation. And it's usually one word that they focus on. So I was looking at the list, and they said, you can choose which one you want. You're the first person that we've talked to, this was 2 years ago, about picking a topic to focus on. So I'm looking at it, and then I was looking at February. They wanted me to do it early in the month, and I thought, well, I do African American history, so I'm pretty busy in February. So I don't want to focus on February, but then the February word, kind of caught my attention, and it was courage. I was thinking, okay, I can do courage. Well, I made the mistake of showing this list to my mother. So I can say this about Mom right now because she's not here. But Dr. Baldwin, who knows my mother, he may tell, I hope you won't tell on me that I'm talking about her tonight. Mom looked at the list and she said, no, you don't do courage. She said, you do that all the time. That's what you do as a historian. You're always talking about people who have practiced courage in some form or fashion in the things that they've done through their lives. So why don't you pick the word curiosity? So which was March. I looked at it. I said, okay, I listened to Mom. That was a mistake because I spent about 6 months sweating bullets about what am I going to do with this topic of curiosity. But then I was asked by the organizers of this event to give them a blurb about what I was going to talk about. And I started thinking about this a lot. Okay, what can I do with this topic of curiosity? This was the blurb that I sent them for that talk. I said, curiosity, or being curious, is central to our humanity, and it really, really is. It's central to who we are. But in what direction does our curiosity lead us? While a curious spirit often pushes us or propels us forward, and it does, it's the exploration, it's what makes us explore. I said, is there something to be gained from a consciousness, from a curiousness that prompts us to look back? Should we look back? We're having a lot of conversations in our country now about history. We are in this moment right now. If you did not know which would be the sesquicentennial, I have to say about that word. Once I learned to pronounce that word, I said I'm going to use it every chance I get. but the 150th anniversary of what would be American Reconstruction, this volatile time in American history. It's interesting, as we were going through the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, there were all of these conversations that were going on about the American Civil War. In fact, the New York Times did a blog for the 4-year period that the war was happening to follow every event that was going on. The blog ended when the war would have ended itself. But no one's having any conversations about Reconstruction. This is an interesting time, but it's almost as the conversations that we're having now about memory, Civil War memory, about monuments and things like that, as if we're going through another Reconstruction at this point in time in our history. Looking back can be painful sometimes, but there's some things that we can learn. I started thinking about the word curiosity as well, and it made me think about the Mars rover Curiosity. How many of you remember back in 2011, I think it was launched to Mars. It's still on Mars now, can't come back. But it was sending us all of these pictures from Mars. So we were getting a chance to see what the planet looks like. But I was wondering, how did they get the name Curiosity for the rover? Well, they did a contest back in 2010, and a young lady named Clara Ma, who at the time was only 13 years old when she submitted an essay. And in her essay, she made this statement, and she won the contest. She proposed the name Curiosity, and this is what she said. Curiosity is an everlasting flame that burns in everyone's mind. It makes me get up out of bed in the morning and wonder what surprises life will throw at me that day. Curiosity is such a powerful force. Without it, we wouldn't be who we are today. Think about that, we wouldn't. Curiosity is the passion that drives us through our everyday lives. We have become explorers, scientists with our need to ask questions and to wonder. Clara Ma, very brilliant young lady, being 13 years old when she wrote this essay to name the Mars rover. So I thought about, okay, think about as the rover, what if we could have been the rover traveling from Earth to Mars and all of the things that we would see. And I thought it's interesting that while those pictures and the things that we would see if we were traveling from Earth to Mars would be new to us, those things have always been there. They're history. So there's a looking back that goes with the exploration. Does that make sense? There's a history that is there. So it made me start thinking about my own curiosity. Sometimes we try to tamp down people's curiosity because curiosity can get us in trouble, right? I thought about Curious George. How many of you have heard of Curious George? When I was growing up as a kid, I loved to read the stories about Curious George and the man with the big yellow hat. And I've jokingly said that's probably not politically correct anymore, but Curious George nonetheless. I mean, he was always getting in all of this trouble, exploring things. So I have two stories about my own curiousness. Gets you in trouble. These are funny stories, at least to me they are. 2 times. My father had this car when I was growing up that, did not have the gears where you shift it into gear, didn't have it, you push buttons to actually get it into gears. One of these old cars. He left me in the car one day when he was in some office doing business. He left the car running, and he told me specifically, don't touch any buttons. But watching him touch these buttons, I had to just be curious enough to push one of those buttons. And my, the car jumped the curve and ran into the building. So boom, he said all he felt was just the building just shaking. And I discovered that curiosity can kind of be painful, if you know what I mean. Another time that I was very curious was when my mother and my uncle never lets me forget this story about being on vacation when we were in Atlanta. I didn't know how to swim, but my mother said, I'll let you go outside. I was dressed up to go outside. My older brother and my dad and his brother were in the pool. They knew how to swim. And she said, do not get close to the swimming pool. But I was curious enough to get close to the edge, just wanted to touch the water. And you know what happened. I ended up falling in. And my uncle said that I showed up back in the room and all I did was looked at my mother and said, I got wet. So curiosity can get us into trouble. It can, but once again, it can allow us to explore, and it can allow us to make new discoveries. The historian in me, I have to look back and think about those things. So when I started thinking about Plato's Republic, I don't know if any of you have ever sat down and read the Republic of Plato, but it is interesting to read this book because at the beginning of it, he has Socrates on this journey. And as Socrates is beginning this journey, he stops to talk to these elders in the community, and he basically says, look, I would like to have a conversation. I would like to talk to you about your journey, the journey that you have taken. Because if I talk to you, maybe I can discover what my journey might be. And you can give me some advice on how to guide me through this journey. I fear that in the world that we're living in today, we don't always listen to the elders in the community. We're so forward thinking. And there have been many people who have written about this. I have become, in my most recent time, a student of Alexis de Tocqueville. And I encourage people all the time to go back and sit down and read Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America if you haven't read it, to see what he has to say about the United States, because he's like almost picture perfect in describing who we are. But we should listen to the elders. One of the things that de Tocqueville says about American democracy, he said Americans are so present thinking and so looking to the future that they forget about the past. They don't think about the past. They don't care for the past that much. So I would encourage you to do that. If I encouraged you, I left you with anything, a desire to be more on task about listening to those who have come before us. I want to talk about three figures here, three people who I look at them this way. One of these figures inspired my curiosity. Another of these figures encouraged the curiosity. And then the third figure, the third and last figure, all who were mentors in my life, guided it. The first figure that I want to bring up here is Mr. Isaiah Rice. Mr. Rice was my grandfather. Born in 1917, he passed away in 1980. One of the most rewarding things about my time back here in Asheville has been we have been able to kind of resurrect my grandfather. Because over the course of his life, his curiosity had him taking photographs of Asheville. And he has one of the most, he compiled what was essentially one of the most extensive photograph collections of a African-American community in southern Appalachia that exists today. No other collection like this exists. My mother recently allowed the UNC Asheville to digitize every last one of the photographs. There are about 1,500 photographs in this collection. And it tells us a story of the history of the African-American community in Asheville from the late 1940s all the way to 1980. An exhibit of his work will be opening in downtown Asheville on May 17th this month. So I encourage you, if you're curious about those photographs, you can go see some of them there. But I remember a conversation I had with my grandmother about my grandfather just before she passed away. And the one thing she said to me about his photography, she said, Darin, your grandfather didn't have many vices, but taking photographs was one of those vices. And she said, I decided to live with them. And I'm glad that she did, because we can now know this very rich story about the history of the African-American community here in Asheville through the photographs that he took. But he really did inspire my curiosity, because I watched both he and my grandmother and the lives that they led. They traveled the world. They went to other countries, went to places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic. They were always taking photographs. They would bring these photographs back, and we would sit there and we would look at these photographs. They would talk about these places that they had been. So when I think about my grandparents, and especially Mr. Rice, I think about someone who opened my eyes to a broader world. And based on what I've heard tonight about the accomplishments of many of the students who are here, you're already thinking about the world outside of these mountains, these beautiful mountains where we have the opportunity to grow. But it's a much bigger world. And as we think about where we're going, we're becoming so much more of a global community that understanding the experiences of other people, I think, is going to be fundamentally important to how you live out the rest of your life. So I'm very grateful to my grandparents for opening up that broader world for me, to let me know that there was something outside of the space where I grew up, that there was more that I could explore. So I look at these two people, and especially my grandfather, as someone who inspired my curiosity. Robert Kennedy once said, "Some men see things as they are and say, 'Why?' I dream things that never were and say, 'Why not?'" You can hear the curiosity in that quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. So the next person I want to kind of refer to here is Mr. James A. Parker. Mr. Parker, for about 23 years, was my mentor. He really encouraged me to explore new things. I worked as a probation parole officer in Raleigh. Before I went to graduate school, worked as a probation parole officer in Raleigh for 5 years, going in and out of communities, going in and out of the North Carolina prison system. But I was always itching to try something new. But you can become very comfortable in the space where you are. And I remember Mr. Parker encouraging me to consider graduate school. I was just telling this story a few minutes ago at my table that I had always aspired to be an attorney. And Mr. Parker just instinctively knew that that was not where my real interest was. And I'm glad I chose to listen to his advice on how he guided me on to graduate school. So I remember leaving my job after 5 years. By that time, I think my wife and I, we had our oldest son was born that year. And it was a scary thing to do, to kind of go out, to quit a job that I had been in for so long, to take on something new. But I remember Mr. Parker saying to me when I said to him, "I'm leaving my comfort zone." And he said to me, "That's okay. You will find a new comfort zone, like many of you will when you graduate from high school and you go on to college. It will be a transition." But he said, "You will find a new comfort zone." He said, "But the question is going to be, once it is time for you to move again, will you have the courage to do it?" So we're always moving. We're always growing. Life should always be a constant moving to something new. You don't have to, but as far as your mind and exploring and growing in how we think about things and how we see the broader world, I hope that you will always kind of be a student and be a scholar. And that's what he encouraged me to do. So he encouraged me to go into graduate school. I told a story a few minutes ago that I had the opportunity, I was given the opportunity or asked if I would consider coming to live and work in Washington, D.C. back in 2001. And I had just finished my master's degree at North Carolina State, and I really wanted to take this job. By that time, we had our second son, my two sons, Jonathan and Lewis. And I was thinking, I need to stop with school. It's time for me to go on and do some work now to earn a living. I have a father who at that time in his life was taking care of 5 kids, and I'm thinking, I'm not really following the example of my father here. So, I'm kind of just in graduate school having fun, and it was fun. But I remember Mr. Parker, the person who was offering me this position was also one of his proteges. And she said, "Well, I'm going to have to clear this with him before I can offer you the job." And he said she got them together for dinner to talk about the possibility of bringing me to Washington, D.C. She called me the next day and she said, "Darin, when I had that conversation with him," he said, "Absolutely not." Said he needs to stay in North Carolina. He needs to do his PhD. He needs to do it now. I was quite angry with Mr. Parker for this because he didn't talk to me about this. And I think for about a year, he and I didn't have a conversation. I think he knew that. But I'm glad that he kind of did that because my life has been so much more rewarding by having gone on to pursue the PhD and the things that I've been able to do with that. When Mr. Parker died a few years ago, I had the opportunity to speak at his memorial service in Washington, D.C. And I just want to refer back to that on a few things that I actually said about him in that. And I concluded my remarks by briefly highlighting some of the traits that had drawn me to him as a person. I said one thing that I said, it was his knowledge. He had a depth of knowledge. When we met, that was the one thing that really kind of sparked my interest in saying, I really need to know this man because of his experiences and the things that he talked about. And I thought, there's so much that I can learn from him. And I've said this about him a number of times, that I feel that I learned more from him in just a few years than I did in the 4 years of undergraduate study. In fact, I said that Virginia at the time should have given him the right to actually issue diplomas as a university himself, just the depth of knowledge. So another thing that drew me to him was his patience. Mr. Parker would sit calmly, listen to to what I would have to say, my laundry list of complaints. He did this as I was going through graduate school. I remember another story that I'll kind of insert here about his commitment to seeing that I get through this process, that while I was in studying and working towards the PhD, writing my dissertation, he got sick with cancer. And at one point, he actually had to be put in a coma. And I remember calling his wife, Mrs. Parker, saying, I called here from Asheville saying that I really wanted to come and visit. And she told me, she said, Darin, she said, I believe that he's going to be okay, but he gave me specific instructions about you. And that was this, that if you cannot tell us that you have finished that PhD, then you cannot come to Washington, D.C. But he was extremely patient. And so he really pushed, and he was someone who was very dedicated. And another thing that drew me to him was that he had a very deep and rich sense of humor. So I'm happy to pay tribute to Mr. Parker as one of those people who's helped to form and fashion and drive my curious spirit. So he's the person who encouraged it. I have here also a quote by Thomas Jefferson as I go into talking about the next person I want to kind of highlight here. And Thomas Jefferson said this, and this is something as students that I hope will stay with you for the rest of your life as you think about this. But Jefferson said, he who knows best knows how little he knows. I think I'm amazed at the fact that now that I have a PhD, I thought that was supposed to put me in this space where, I'm the smartest person in the room. But I've realized now how little I really do know. So the person that I think that really embodies this spirit was John Hope Franklin. And if any of you do not know who John Hope Franklin was, he was by far one of the greatest historians that this country ever produced. And when it comes to the history of African Americans and the field of African American history, he really single-handedly took that field of history to a whole nother level during the course of his life. He was the holder of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He won the John Kluge Prize, and if you haven't heard of the John Kluge Prize, but John Kluge Prize was the equivalent of the Nobel, because Alfred Nobel did not set up a prize for the field of the humanities. So John Kluge, who was a billionaire, set up a prize called the Kluge Prize, which is given through the Library of Congress. It's a $1 million award. Dr. Franklin won this award for his lifetime achievements in the field of the humanities and as a historian. He was the first African American to be inducted into the American Philosophical Society. And if you know that, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Ben Franklin. So this man is someone who had these major accomplishments over the course of his life. I bring him up here because and I have a picture of his autobiography there as well, and I would encourage you to get his autobiography, Mirror to America, which was published in the early 2000s, just before he passed away, just to hear him talk about his experiences and how he kind of navigated that over the course of his life. But Dr. Franklin, at 92 years old, when I was coming through my PhD, he was retired. My dissertation advisor, Dr. Harry Watson, as I was working to put together my dissertation committee, said to me one day, he said, you need to call Dr. Franklin and ask him to be on your committee. And I'm thinking, there's no way he's going to do that. He's 92 years old. But he said, you don't know, but secretly periodically he calls me to check on how you're doing through this program. So what I find so amazing about his spirit, about this man, that even though he had reached such big heights in his life and in his career, he was still willing to reach down to teach those and bring other people along. And I believe that this is something that all of us need to learn to do more. And so for him, throughout this whole process, he guided the curiosity, my curiousness in exploring the past. It called on me to kind of be studious and to be willing to listen. And I believe that curiosity, even though it can lead us to kind of explore, it does have to be tamed and it has to be guided. So that's Dr. Franklin. I want to finish here with a question. Is how do we remain creatively curious? I put the word creative in there because curiousness to me is about being creative. How can we remain creative? As a joke, I've stuck in a slide, the next slide of an image here. And this is an image of my two sons, my two wonderful sons. As you can see in this picture, this is a photograph of me looking at my two sons. And as you can see, these two are full of melodramatics. They just are. They're always acting. One of them has been an actor. This is what he aspires to do. The other, they keep me very curious. So I said, what do we need to do to remain creatively curious? You can get two of these because they keep me wanting to get two of these. And those of you who are graduating from high school, no time soon. But later in your life, but if you're engaged, I think if you're engaged with people, younger people, it will keep you curious. It will keep you, because I'm always wondering about these two. What are they doing? How are they doing it? And as I just said just a few minutes ago, when will they get off my payroll? The oldest one is pretty much off of it, but every now and then he still has to come and give it. But remaining curious is to open up books to read. I have to tell my students, you're surprised, go read a book, please. I'm surprised at how little reading we do today. But continue to read, to engage in books. I mean, make books your friend. I'm saying if that's the one thing that I can do, is to get people to love to read, because it is a way to continue to explore and open your mind to new worlds. This is a quote by Albert Einstein. And I find this quote amazing. It was in an interview that he gave, and there's a larger quote, but I took this part of it out where he said, I am neither clever nor especially gifted. And when you think of Einstein, you think of someone who was very clever, who was extremely gifted. But he didn't see himself that way. I was reading not too long ago an article that he wrote back in the 1940s called What Do I Believe? And in that article, he said that he lived his life with this fear that he had borrowed too much from the work of other men. This is Einstein. But at least he knew to look back, that he knew that his life had been built on what other people had done before him. And going back to books, too, I think about a quote from T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, one time, his students said to him, were complaining about the fact that he was always assigning and asking them to read the old authors, to read the old books. And the students said to him, his students complained and said, why do we have to read these old books and these old writers? Because we know so much more than they know. And T.S. Eliot's retort was, yes, and it is they that we know. So think about that. There's something from these foundational people that we can truly learn. But I love this quote. I'm neither clever nor especially gifted. I am only very, very curious. And I think that if we remain very curious, it will continue to lead you to do new things, to grow. And I think that this is a lifelong process. I really thought that once I finished this last degree that would be it, but it's not. I continue to explore. Dr. Franklin, at 92 years old, I remember him saying that he was beginning to explore a whole new genre of history. He said, I realize how much work that I've done in these other fields, but how little I know about the history of women in this country and the contributions that they have made. So at 92 years old, he was beginning to explore a whole new genre and a whole new field of history. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this talk about where we are as a community. There are a lot of conversations that are going on right now, and you all, as you graduate and get ready to go into the world, going to college, it's a different experience. You're going to be hearing some of these conversations. There are a lot of conflicts that are taking place on college campuses across the country, and you'll see that. We're in this period now where we've got what one historian has called monument mania. You've heard some of the things you've heard about what happened at Chapel Hill not too long ago. But I think that what we need to do is to really try to engage each other in a civil way. So the Institute for Emerging Issues, which is housed at North Carolina State University, has launched this 3-year project across the state of North Carolina where they're having conversations about how do we reconnect to community. And I think that is for us to be curious about other people and their experiences and be willing to engage other people and their experiences. Sometimes that process can be very painful. I come from a community and from a group of peoples whose history does not fit very well into this triumphalist kind of narrative of American history, because the African American experience has been one that has been filled with so much pain and so much suffering. And I feel that at times we're unwilling to actually confront that. But there are a number of historians who are saying that in order for us to move together as a community, as a state, as a nation, that we have to be willing to come around and have these honest conversations with each other about what these experiences have been. So I hope that, if anything, I've encouraged you to see that curiosity is a very powerful thing. I read an article in preparation for that talk where one person, this whole idea and conversation that is going on across the country about monuments and what monuments mean is not just something that is here in the South, that we're dealing with here in the southern part of the country, but northern states are dealing with it as well. So New York had a commission, the mayor of New York City created this commission to study some of the monuments in New York City. And I was surprised to see that there was this controversy around Christopher Columbus. But one author actually said, but let's think about it. We are the product of Columbus's curiosity. So that's a part of this that I think that we have to see, if that makes sense. We need to have a balanced conversation about these things. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So as we think about the past and we think about the experiences that other people have had, I hope that we will do it in a way that promotes mutual understanding rather than mutual resentments. So I hope that as you move forward with your lives, as you go on to college, as you graduate from high school, that you will remain always very, very curious and explore. Thank you so much.